While in the UK we had a different rental model from that of the US, this was about to start changing. Change always brings opportunity, and yet, like today, most people are resistant to change and miss out on the early opportunities, only to say later, I wished I'd acted sooner. As we come to the end of the 70s, our socialist experiment seems to be running out of steam. High inflation peaking at 25%, high interest rates with a bank rate of 14%, unions so powerful that they can bring down governments, as they did in 1974. We entered the winter of discontent of 1978-79, known as the sick man of Europe, where the International Monetary Fund had to come in and rescue us. A severe winter saw multiple public and private sector strikes that left the dead unburied, rubbish uncollected in the streets with rats crawling all over them. In February, the Prime Minister, Jim Callaghan, was met at the airport after flying in from a summit in the Caribbean, where pictures had been broadcast back to the UK television screens showing him in a Hawaiian shirt, basking in the sun, and he was asked, "What are you going to do about the crisis?" the next day. Because of his response, the headline appeared in one paper, "Crisis? What crisis?" It seemed like the government was out of touch with the people and wanted change. Does this sound familiar? The reason I mention this, I will come to later, but change did come. In May 1979, with the election of Margaret Thatcher. In 1980, she passed a law giving council house tenants the right to buy their council houses. What is rarely understood is that the right to buy existed as far back as 1936, although it did require ministerial approval. A more recent policy was introduced by Edward Heath's government of 1970-74. It was, however, the introduction of large discounts up to 50% that really fueled the sale of council homes, as it made it cheaper to buy on a mortgage than to rent. The mortgage market was deregulated in 1982. Up until this time had been the preserve of building societies. But it was not until 1984 that the banks really entered the mortgage market in earnest. Then, in 1988, the Housing Act of England and Wales, and a separate act in Scotland, introduced short-term tenancies, which relieved landlords the burden of having lifetime tenants. Then in 1996, the banks introduced specialist buy-to-let mortgages, and people started to look at property investment as an alternative to their pension plans. However, the real driver for growth in the number of buy-to-let properties came with the rise of training companies using ideas imported from the US, now that the UK had a similar rental model for single lets. Also, during this period, we saw the influx of foreign investment, which had been facilitated by the abolition of exchange controls in the early days of the Thatcher government in 1979. It meant that we could take money out of the country, but it also meant that investors could feel quite relaxed about bringing money into the country, as they would be able to remove it if they so desired. This benefited the wider economy, and we became one of the most desirable places in the world to invest in. Higher rates of corporation tax from 52% in 1978 coming down to 25% by 1988, and eventually 21% by 1997. Deregulation, increased mobility, and changes in the family unit fueled the need for more rental properties, and the advance of globalization, which started with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we see the explosion of the buy-to-let sector.